Hey, everybody, welcome to Healing Conversations. This time we're not coming from the Legacy Lounge. We're actually in place at Legacy Church. This is Pastor Rosmery Peña. Yes, I got to say my Spanish name. And we're going to have a very sensitive conversation this morning. You saw the warning prior to the video recording. But I want you to just be mindful of that for some of you who have experienced certain trauma in your life, this conversation could be triggering for you. And so if you have to pause, if you have to exit the conversation, that's okay. If you have to cry through it and engage it, our objective in breaking the silence off of certain things, especially that are very much cultural to where we are filming from, which is Nassau, the Bahamas, that our objective is really to bring you into at least taking the steps or the necessary beginnings towards dealing with trauma and getting to a place of healing. And for some of you, re-engaging, because some of you have started your journey of healing, but paused or maybe vacated the process because it got difficult or whatever else. And for those of you that may not necessarily have been affected by anything like what we are talking about today, that you be the support system for people that have experienced different levels of trauma and that need a village around them to help them on that journey of recovery and that journey of healing. So whether you are the victim, the perpetrator, or you are the village, all of us are on a healing journey, and we just want to have the conversations that will break the silence off of certain things that, whether culturally or because of our families, have remained in the darkness of silence and need the light of conversation to be shined upon it, to have a transparent, vulnerable exchange concerning the things that we've experienced, and to begin our healing journey together. So today, we have with us someone that is dear to my heart. She's actually my nail tech, y'all. She's been on the journey with me concerning my beauty for quite some time. She's an excellent nail tech, and the conversations I think that we have around our time together, that's really what's good. Is that we are in that intimate space and we talk about everything from politics to these kind of conversations. We've already had them to just what is going on around us and what God is doing, what Holy Spirit is saying. It's amazing. I think every time we schedule a time to talk. But today, Shantel Roberts is going to bring us into a very vulnerable part of her journey and life, and to some of the areas of healing that she has already come into. It's a vulnerable exchange and sensitive topic, but we are having a conversation around incest. And I don't think that I've seen that conversation too much on a public platform, but we know that in our context, in the Bahamas, it is something that needs to be talked about and that we do need to break the silence concerning it. So we're going to just allow Shantel to bring us into her story, bring us into the intimate details of her story. Pray for her as she shares and as you watch, and thank God that she has the courage and the willingness to be vulnerable enough to bring us into this part of her life. So, Shantel.
Thank you for having me. Thank you guys for watching. I'm glad to be here, even though it's kind of a it's like a nervousness as well as, just overall concern. But it is a necessary conversation that needs to be had. I think that today, sharing my story, one thing that I would like people to be able to take from it is the importance of breaking the silence. Yeah. Moving into that place where it's no longer something that is just going around in your mind, something that you're experiencing and allowing it to keep you imprisoned to it. So for me today, it's about making sure that I am sharing my story, and perhaps even if it's just one person out there that can be helped by it, I think that's a victory, especially in our times and what it is that we're trying to do here by allowing people a platform and a place where they can feel safe and secure. And I think I would not be able to do this today if I didn't have a community like Legacy behind me, just journeying alongside me, encouraging me to continuously push, because sharing and healing isn't easy. It's not an easy thing. So just knowing that I have a community and the importance of it in this time of my life, I am very grateful. So I just wanted to say that first. And then I will start my story off by when I first, at the time, I think my incest started when I was about maybe 7 or 8. Now, of course, I didn't know what to call it, but it started happening, and it was being done by my grandfather. And in experiencing that, I remember just him touching me, and it would mostly happen at night when I would go to bed, because at that time I would share a bed with my grandmother and grandfather. And at night he would touch me, and then I would be left with this feeling of not knowing, I know something's wrong with this, but I don't know for sure if it's wrong. So it was very weird, because my grandmother, she loved this song that she used to sing, and it was a every night thing. And the song is called He Touched Me. So the song goes, he touched me, oh, he touched me, and all the joy that fills my soul. Something happened, and now I know he touched me and made me whole. And being there in that moment, and just listening in the stillness of my own mind, I mean, hearing the words, understanding what is going to happen to me once she goes to sleep, it left like a weird thing. It was almost like a cloud of not knowing what is going on. Why is she singing this song? How I don't feel whole. I didn't even know what wholeness was. It was just okay, so I know the whole thing, what's about to happen. And I would just go to sleep, and then I would press my body up against hers, because I felt like if I did that, he would be, that would stop him from actually feeling me up. But it didn't, and for a very long time I went on experiencing that at night. Now, there was one day I attended Palmdale Primary, that's a primary school here in the Bahamas. And we had an assembly that starts first thing in the morning, and they had police officers there. And the police officers were explaining to us, they had this diagram of this little girl, and they said, they showed us the bathing suit area, like the breast and the sexual area, and they were like, nobody is supposed to touch you in these areas. And if there was anybody that did, it was wrong. And that you had to now go and tell somebody who you trust. So in that moment, standing in that assembly, I was in grade 6, so I must have been 10, 11.
So let's pause for a minute and go back and paint the picture. As far as your memory goes, you are put in a situation where I would imagine maybe it doesn't happen every night, but most nights.
Right.
Your grandfather waited until your grandmother fell asleep, and he will begin to touch you in your genital areas.
Yes.
And nightly, as a ritual, before this ritual happens, your grandmother sings a hymn.
Right.
That has to do with the healing touch of God.
Yes.
But to a 7-year-old mind, you have yet to understand the messaging of the hymn. And And we're going to touch on all of the ways that this then plays out in your life, but I
Right.
just want to paint the picture.
Yeah.
There is a knowing innately in us when something is not right, even
Right.
if we don't necessarily know what to call it or even understand the whole concept of why it is wrong. You feel it.
Yes.
In our knower, we know. There's something about this that is not quite right.
Right.
And you are a brilliant woman, so I imagine that even as a child you were highly intelligent. But more than your intelligence, what's striking about you is your intuitiveness,
Yes.
your ability to connect with your emotions and the emotional realities around you in a big way. Like you're connected at a different level. And so I could imagine that even as a child, you're not only sensing that it is wrong, but you know that he knows it is wrong because of the times that he waits for
Right.
to do that to you. And it's not until 3 years later that the conversation is being had in a public setting where what you sensed and knew but could not talk about necessarily, because even the silence tells you that somewhere you knew that what was happening to you was wrong, but you hadn't said anything to anyone. Now you are being given information that solidifies.
It did.
How did you feel, if you could remember? I don't know, it's a long time ago. Sometimes we can't.
That I remember.
Okay.
That day I remember.
How did you feel sitting there and putting the pieces together? Like what this officer is describing, it's what's happening to me. But it's also what's happening to me with my own grandfather. How did you feel in that moment?
Well, there were so many emotions like flooding me at that moment, because I stood there and like even in my mind, what was going through my mind was that this was wrong. It was wrong what was happening to me. I had now words for what I was feeling. And in me feeling that emotion in the moment, I got angry. I was angry. And then even in the midst of the officer saying, well, you should tell somebody that you trust, my thought immediately went to my grandmother. Like, I need to talk to my grandmother. Now, I was always a kind of quiet child and reserved, but from me, it was like, yes, I need to talk to my grandmother. And that's something that I did immediately after, because my grandmother worked at the school that I was attending. So when I ran to her, I waited until we had a break, because we had to go afterwards to class, and then I had a break. And when I went to break, I went and I found her. And I told her, I said, Grammy, I used to call my grandfather Daddy. So I said, Daddy is touching me in my private area, like what the guy was talking about at assembly this morning. And the look on her face, she was shocked. She looked shocked. She was angry at me. Well, I assumed that her anger was toward me. Because immediately after I said that and her initial shock, she was like, you lying, you're a slut. And I'm like, what? Now, of course, at that time, I didn't know what that meant. All I knew was my grandmother was angry. And that my grandmother was the most dearest person to my heart. She's no longer alive. And I think for me that day, something died. My desire to tell died. My trust level for her being that person for me that I could talk to and connect with died. Even in the midst of me being able to speak my truth, it died. It all died that day. And I walked away from that experience feeling like there was nothing that I could do. There was nothing that I could say. I followed the instructions that were given to me, and that's what I was faced with. And it made me retreat to a place where I felt like I never wanted that to happen to me again. So even though I have to go home and think about the next time that this thing happens to me, there's nobody I could talk to.
So there was a sense of hopelessness.
Hopelessness.
Now. You have to resign yourself to allowing this thing to happen.
Yeah.
Do you think that your grandmother had a conversation with your grandfather? Did any of his behavior change after you shared with her what was happening to you?
Well, I don't know. Well, that day at school, and then of course going home. I don't know. I don't remember how many days after I would have told her, but something I said did have an effect, because we would go to bed the usual time, and like I say, it was kind of a ritual for her, and then she would go to bed, and when she went to sleep, he started touching me again. But I think she wasn't asleep at that time, because immediately after he started touching me, she moved me to the front of the bed. And before I knew it, I was not sharing the bed with them anymore, but was sharing a bed that was in the room. And then after that, I had my own room because an uncle that lived there moved out, and I was able to have my own space. But I remember, like, there was no conversation. She had no conversation with me about the changes that was happening. I just knew that basically, even though she was angry, she made the necessary changes needed to separate me from my grandfather. But there was no conversation.
So she just maneuvered your changes. Wow. This is a lot. But I want to take you back, because you and I had this conversation in a more, some of the more vulnerable things that I think victims don't necessarily share. Mm-hmm. And I'll jog your memory, and you can, if you want to, go into that aspect of some of the confusion for you, because the reality is that when your genitals are maneuvered, they're touched, there is sensation that your physical body feels, whether you want to or not.
Right.
But for you, in your 10-year-old brain, in your 7-year-old brain, kind of connecting the concept that this could be completely wrong, but at some point there are some pleasures involved in it. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about the confusion of that. If you want to, you don't necessarily have to, but if you want to go a little deeper into that for us.
I think for me, in journeying through that stimulation part of it, it awakened something in me. Like I said, no language for it because of that age. But it did awaken something inside me to a place where, like, the only thing I could say was it was something that I became used to, and the aspect about it in terms of the stimulation was something that I started to enjoy. Now, even though I knew it was wrong, even in terms of me moving a bit away from that, like getting older, I seek that stimulation, whether it be me doing it to myself or seeking other people to do it too, because I don't think people realize that once you've been opened up sexually, there are times where you do find friends or family members that are at the same age level as you. And the fact that you're seeking that stimulation now, even though it's wrong.
Because you've been triggered to it.
Right.
So now you're seeking for the very thing that you knew this is not right.
Right.
But now you're awakened to the pleasure of it.
Yes.
And even the confusion for you, was there a moment as you are experiencing it from your grandfather where you are literally in this
battling in your head.
Yeah.
Where this shouldn't be happening, but it is. But I like it. It's like, it's rough. Like, the only way I could say it is it's rough because you build an identity from it to the point of it's no longer an act anymore. It, like, you make it more than what it is. And, like, what do I want to say? How can I? Okay, so it's like you're allowing your body to have the experience of it, but you're not there. Like, you're taking yourself out. You're having like an out-of-body experience, but you're there and you're experiencing it and you're allowing it to happen. So it's like trying to make those things connect in your mind, especially being a child, and not having the proper language or not having the understanding and still not being able to even talk about it. Like, there's no talking about that.
So we're going to get to when you broke the silence beyond your grandmother. But man, there's so much, right?
It is.
There's so
It's
much
a lot.
to address, I think, in your story because it is so intricate. It is so complex. But we know culturally in the Bahamas, unfortunately, we have seen it on Facebook public platforms where there has been, even recent times, where there has been exposure
Yes.
of some victimization of children in schools with leadership, people in places of leadership, teachers, etc. That culturally we do victimize the victims,
Yep.
especially when the victims are girls. And that your grandmother's response to you is a real reflection. I hung my head in that moment because I can't imagine the impact to a 10-year-old who has been given and granted freedom to say, if this has happened to you, go to your safety.
Somebody you're safe with.
Go to your safety and tell them what's happening. And you go to your grandmother and you are met with assault to you immediately. Now we see in your story that she did start to make some adjustments, bringing you to the forefront in front of her rather than in the middle of both of you, but without conversation, without communication. So what is loudest to you is you are a slut. And what that translates to is what's happening to you is your fault.
Right.
How did that perpetuate itself in your life as an adolescent, still before teenage years, and then with all of the transformation that comes during your teenage years and then into adulthood? What was the impact of those words to you, to the best that you can describe?
As I moved through becoming from adolescence into teenage years, not being able to have a conversation. I mean, I think eventually I shared it with my friends because, you go to school, you start making friends with other people. I think one of the main things that people need to understand is this. It doesn't end. What I mean by that is this. That incident, those incidences happened to me in my home with someone who I trusted and I knew. And I found that as I started to journey, there were other things that started to happen to me. Like, I was raped by a family friend, someone who I knew well. And because of the beginning of how everything started and me losing my voice even in that moment, I couldn't even go to my grandmother and tell her what happened. And I remember it's like you having to keep so many secrets.
How old were you when you were raped?
I was 14.
Wow. Okay. And that one you didn't speak?
No.
Because now there is no safety.
No.
So, I mean, when your grandmother responded to you, she silenced you, and she removed, it's like the bottom fell out for you,
Right.
because now your grandfather, who was supposed to protect you, and your grandmother, who was supposed to
Supposed
be your
protect me.
safe
Yeah.
space.
And even the way I said, boy, the enemy is so crafty, because even in the way that that rape happened, it was a friend, like we were young kids all hanging out together, and then there was a female that came to the house to ask me if I could go with her to get her sister. And me trusting her enough to take that journey, my grandmother trusting her enough to allow me to go, there was her male cousin that did it, and her assisting him with raping me. She sat there and she watched. And when I say that would have been the second person that I trusted, and this is a female who, for me, it's like in that moment I couldn't factor in, like, why would you as a woman be okay with something like this happening, and just remembering the emptiness, and it's like, this is going to continue to happen to me.
So you believed that in that
I
moment?
did.
And did it happen?
Yes.
Other times?
It did. It was almost like without the knowing of how to stop it, it would be situations that would just happen, and by people who I trusted. Even in terms of like speaking to different people, because I remember one time as a teenager, I was put in the care of some people for a day, like to hang out with this lady, because I was waiting to get a job, like a summer job, and they didn't have a job for me that day, so I had to stay with this lady until my friend's parents came home, and me sharing my story with this lady. And she was saying that she wanted to open a place for young women, Christian young women, and to help them and everything. So I felt comfortable. I was just looking for a safe place, and I felt comfortable to share my story with her. And to hear the story that I told her in confidence come back, and in the way that it came back, it was almost like I was orchestrating these events and causing these things to happen to me. And like I'm smiling because I'm thinking about it from this standpoint that I'm at now, and I realize that there are a lot of people, especially because it happened to me, going through the experiences and continued going through the experiences, even to the point of being in a relationship with somebody that you love and having them rape you within the relationship, and thinking like, well, this person loved me, it can be rape. But I was saying no, and they weren't listening to me. So how you're compiling all of this stuff, there's a level of worthlessness that came with it. It made me feel like I wasn't worthy of love. I remember going into relationships simply because I wanted the affection, not necessarily the sex of it, but the affection that came with just having somebody see you. And how it consistently just perpetuated itself over the years. And I got to the point where I just became numb. So by the time as I arrived at adulthood, I just was having sex and not caring about it, becoming very numb, not expecting love. When things happened to me, I would just automatically make myself the fault. And it just, to me, it was a never-ending cycle of stuff happening. It wasn't until I got saved that I started to get language for my life and what was actually happening to me. And the fact that I didn't have to be that way. I didn't have to be as sexual as I was. I didn't have to continue to hide things. I didn't have to continue to hold my pain in. I should be able now to find a safe place and a free place where I can not just talk about my story, but also receive the help. That's what I thought. You know what I mean?
So we're gonna get to your salvation story and the pivot and the divine interruption.
Right.
really to the narrative. Of course, we know that all of us are in this, process of healing, and that when the trauma is as deep as what you've experienced in your life, because you just gave us a glimpse into, and of course, for the sake of time, we can't even necessarily go into the full details of everything you experienced from the time you were an adolescent into your teenage years when you're trying to find your identity, but now it has been so damaged because it happened with your primary caregivers and the people that were entrusted to take care of you and to help you formulate your personhood, your identity, and to come into the understanding of who Shantel Roberts is when the break happens at the foundation. And then what I heard you say is that you eventually settled into, this is what you deserve, and this is something you can't break out of. It's just going to keep happening to you, because it did.
Yes, it did.
Because it didn't matter where you thought there was safety. There wasn't safety.
Right.
And these kinds of assaults kept on showing up in your life. How old were you when you came to faith? And what did it take to accept Jesus? And I'm saying that because I'm going back to how religion then was presented to you. It was presented to you in the context of your molestation. Because I just, I don't think I even have the language to consider what happens to you when your grandfather is touching you and your grandmother is singing, "He touched you, he touched me." And what she's singing about is a glorious concept, because the touch of God is a healing touch. But oftentimes we do look at those people in authority as, godlike to us. They are the representation of what God is supposed to be, or at least we get to God through the filter of what we've experienced with our parents, what we've experienced with our teachers, what we've experienced with our pastors and leaders, etc. This is why I'm so big on the concept of sacred leadership.
Yeah.
That if you've been entrusted with a life, how you touch them matters, because you will oftentimes represent the God that wants to touch them with a healing touch. And so our touch of violence, our touch of perversion, touching them seductively, all of those things have impact on a soul that I can't imagine. So I look at you and I'm thinking, you're a sign and a wonder and a miracle. Because for you to be introduced to God to a certain extent, even with the idea that I can't imagine psychologically what a 7, 8, 9-year-old is thinking when you know that after the hymn comes the break. After your grandmother is singing to this God that touches and whose touch makes you whole, that is almost like this is the beginning of what's about to come.
Right.
After she's done singing, she's going to go to sleep. And I'm going to experience a different kind of touch.
Right.
How do you get to God through this? So tell us your salvation story. How did God get to you? Because obviously, really the reality is that he's in hot pursuit of us. And his love is unconditional.
It was very weird. It happened at work. Well, like I said, I was on a destructive path of not caring, not feeling, and just overall feeling worthless.
It manifested in addiction? Was it drugs,
No,
alcohol?
I never, well, I have a family history of drugs and alcohol, but I never went into those type of things. I
So it
think
was just sexual
my
perversion
addiction
and
was
stuff.
more sexual.
Yeah,
Yeah.
gotcha.
So I remember this lady who worked at, there was this place that I worked at, and this lady who was saved, and she used to talk to me ever so often at work. And one day she said to me, she said, you know, fornication is wrong, right? So, I mean, I'm not, I want to say this before I tell you guys what my response was, but because it was very bad. Um, I'm not indulging fornication. It is bad, and it is very destructive. But when she said that to me, this is how bad I was. I said, you know what? I like having sex, and I'm going to have sex until I get tired. And to see her face, she was like, I don't believe you just said that.
You know what? Let me just say, even as a pastor, I'd rather you say that than act like you're not or
No.
pretend, you
Right.
know, because you had no other context or you were introduced to sex and you were awakened,
Yep.
like we said, you know,
Such
to
an
the
early age.
stimulation
Yep.
and all of that. So, yeah.
So it was almost like a defense. At that point, I had started to get like extremely angry, not angry at her, but just become an angry person, because my whole thing is, you are identifying something, but it's only a symptom. So I think the way I responded to her was like, I already know it's wrong. I'm the first person that feels that it's wrong when I'm done doing it, the act. So for me, it was like, just leave me alone. Let me find my way out of this, and you step aside and just let me do my thing, right? Yeah. So I remember having a conversation with, within that week, there was this guy who I would have had a relationship with before, and he basically reached out to me, and he was like, well, I think it's time, I think we should get back together, because we had broken up like many years. And he was like, okay, I'm going away, and when I come back, we'll have a conversation about getting back together. So I was like, oh, okay, all right, fine. He said, I'll be back on a Friday. Little did I know that God already had a plan for me, because as much as I liked having sex, he was done with me living my life the way that I wanted to live it, or that I felt like I wanted to live it, right? So I remember that morning, there was this lady who had a baby, and she had her baby, and she came to have a hairstyle done. And I remember talking to her, and I was like, hey, are you back? How's the baby? And she's telling me, like, you know, it's the baby is wonderful. I'm here to get my due so I could feel good and all of that. So having a conversation with her in the beginning of the day, this was morning. This was like 10 o'clock in the morning. So I went to pick up my son, to go to pick up my son from school. And this is at like 10 minutes to 2, right? And this woman is still in the store. So I didn't think anything of it. I was just like, you know, you're right, forget you, eh? So she sat there and she was looking at me and she just smiled. And I'm like, okay, well, I'll see you later if you're not here when I get back. So when I came back, she was still there. So leading into that afternoon, now this is like 6 o'clock in the afternoon, the woman is still there. And I'm like finishing up with the last client, and I just was telling my client, you know, she was asking me about work, and I telling her how I'm enjoying work and everything. So one of my coworkers came into the room, and she said, my client would like to talk to you. So I was like, your client would like to talk to me? I was like, okay, well, my whole thing was, listen, I hope this woman ain't coming with no religious stuff. I ain't into that. I don't, like, you know how people like to come and say these things? Like, I have a whole to it, right, internally. Mm-hmm. So I went to this private room, and the lady looked at me, and she told me, she was able to tell me a prayer that I prayed. Now, I was in praying to God, because in my mind, I'm like, I know the things that I'm doing, and I don't want to play with God. I don't want to feel like, because I had friends who would do foolishness and then go to church. But back then, I thought, like, you know, you doing foolishness, you stay away from God, because he could jack you up if you play around with him, right? So this woman was able, well, I know now what it was. It was a prophetic word. Yeah. And she was able to tell me a prayer that I prayed to God that I didn't tell no one about. So in that moment, I stood there and I was shocked. I was like, what is happening? And I just remember this peace coming over me. And of course, I wanted to cry, but my whole thing is, man, I'm not going to let this woman see me cry. Like, what? No. So she gave me the word, and then she also said to me that I needed to find a church and attend. And I left that room knowing that something happened to me. I wasn't able to describe it. I just knew. And that night I wept. The person called me who wanted to get back together. And once I heard his voice, it was like something that made me instantly angry. I said, listen, don't ever call me again. So it was in that moment that I realized that something happened to me. I went to church that Sunday, and when I went to church, that was the day that I gave my life to Christ. I was 27.
Wow.
And I remember, like, the church that I was attending at the time, I knew that that's where I needed to be. And that's when I started my journey of learning about inner healing, learning about the things that has been stored in my soul. Every bad experience as well as good experience being stored there, and unless I get healing, they will remain there and consistently manifest in my life. So it was in that moment that I realized I started the journey of inner healing from then. And I kept on digging and digging, and I know that there's more, because based on what I've told you guys, the experiences that I've had, it's a lot to unpack. It wasn't something that I could just get over. And I'm still even now processing, because what God did for me is he gave me language to even what was happening to me. Even in you mentioning the song that my grandmother sang every night before going to bed and being touched by my grandfather, I realized in that moment that song was the very thing that held me together. That song was the song that I had something to look forward to. I had a healing to look forward to. Now, in that moment, I didn't know the power of that song. But even me knowing God and knowing that it is his desire to make sure that we all get to experience healing and we all get to know him, I know that if it had not, he placed intricate things like me going through that healing and being able to go through inner healing. I realized that there were so many junctions where I wasn't aware at the time when I was going through them that he allowed for me to get the refreshing that I needed, to get the encouragement that I needed, spiritual encouragement, even though I wasn't even, well, I was more focused on my pain and not what he left for me to be able to make it to the next stage.
Well, so let's pause there, because even you saying this tells me that you have a whole different, which is the brilliance of who you are, right? And the difference, because I think that when anyone gets to know Shantel, and you come up close, you're not gonna come into someone that is like an Eeyore, just despondent and woe is me, all of that. What you get is joy. You're like giddy and funny and silly at times. Like you laugh for no reason. You love life and you are exuberant. And so when you hear the story, some of the places, like just now, when I think of your grandmother singing that song as a prelude to what you're about to experience, I look at it from a negative place. Like I look at it like the connection to how do you get to God when you've now have this connection. You just said to me, that song was the pronouncement of my healing and not necessarily linked to my trauma. So you see the way that I'm like, you would have to maneuver your way through the darkness that now is presented to you as religion, because now you have a connection to a hymn as a negative connotation. You're like, no, that was the prophetic declaration of what is available in God. And I'm just saying to you that not everybody would literally engage it that way, but it speaks to how you have been wired, I think, to see the sunshine through the rain.
Yes. Yes, and I agree with that.
Honestly, it is who Chantel is. You see the sunshine through the rain, and it's part of your frustration because you're the one that will say to people, the sun is going to shine, and everybody's like, but it's raining. We see the darkness. You're like, no. It's one of the things that you always say to me when I sit down at your station. Things happen,
So
PM.
things can happen.
So things can happen.
Yep.
I
Yep.
love that. I love that about you. How did you, though, maintain that positivity? Because I will give you sanction to be blue, right? Just even listening to your story right now, I believe the audience will say, you can be as negative as you want, take the time, wallow in what you've experienced, because this is rough. This is hard. And as much as I know that you have done work towards inner healing, before inner healing was a conversation in the Bahamas,
Yeah.
you were in the process of engaging inner healing because you sought out the help for yourself. But you have this positivity. Where does that come from? And where did that begin for you?
Now, sitting here today, I'm a whole different person than I was years ago because there was a moment where I was getting high off of being a victim.
Ah.
Now,
Chantel.
I really, honestly, and truly, when you've had so many things happen to you, and being a person growing up, like I was an only child. I'm an only child, and I grew up in a house with adults. So, and I grew up in a culture where you speak when you're spoken to. So, a level of invisibility always was like a cloak over me. Like, so for me now, going into just experiencing the things that I experienced and sharing some of my story with people, there was a level of being addicted to the attention that came with people sympathizing with the fact that you went through something.
Wow.
And having that feeling, so what happens is you do it, and like say I talk to you, and then eventually you get tired of hearing the same story because it's like rehearsing and rehearsing and rehearsing. And then I end up doing it to somebody new who doesn't know my story, and then get to experience that all over again.
That high.
Like the freshness of, oh my God, this is what happened to you. But there had to come a point, and I think even in me being saved, it had to come a point where I wasn't interested in remaining in that state. I need to move now from being a victim. And as I started to journey from being a victim into being a victorious person, I ended up being able to see, like, if you had asked me before getting some of the healing that I received, it would be all bad, like all this happened to me, that happened to me, I would not have been able to identify that there are so many things that I was able to connect with God on, even when I was young, because I did Girl Scouts, I did Awanas. Those are places and stages of my spiritual development, but I didn't know it. I didn't know to call it that. I learned about God. I learned His Word. I learned how to connect with people. There were positive things that was happening that took me out of my immediate environment, even if it was only for an hour or two. So God was intentional about, because you know how we say we are born in sin and shapen in iniquity, right? Because of sin entering, it wasn't that God wanted those things to happen to me. It just was He created a plan to ensure that at the end of it, those things that the enemy tried to use to destroy me, I can now use it to destroy His kingdom.
That's
take
good.
down everything that he tried to set up within my life. But I had to be willing to do the hard work. The nights that I had to cry, the things that I had to face. Even when I turned 30, I'm telling everybody my age, when I became 39, God gave me an assignment to do. And the assignment was to write down every negative thing that ever happened to me. And I'm like, okay, I've done this before. And then he said, well, read it over. And as I started to read over everything, I started noticing that every 9 years I was doing the same thing, just
Wow.
with different people. And I was
Talk
like,
about cycle breaker.
whoa. And I'm like, but I never noticed that I was doing the exact same thing. And then he took me even deeper, where he made me to recognize now that each area of my life, the first going off, I was like enraged for 1 week straight. I wanted to run my car into people, fight, because I started to identify some of the areas of my life where I was being used and manipulated based on my pain. So because I wanted to be out of my environment, there would be people in my life that would give me a place to go, but they would use me in some way. So it was taking me out of a bad situation to put me in a bad situation.
Yeah.
And when I started to discover that, I realized that hurting people hurt people. And it's our responsibility to ensure that, I think God had me do that assignment so that I can be aware of the things that I do, the cycles that was created as a result of the things that I went through. And as I recognized those cycles, he started to now equip me with the information, my own personal information from my childhood, to now help me trace it back to the root cause of it, where now I can take it up from the very root so that these things can produce fruit. Because everything I did after my pain experience, my induction to pain, I continuously manufactured into my life. So I had to now take responsibility. I can't blame my grandfather. I can't blame my grandmother. I feel bad for them because even in the midst of, like you said today in service, just identifying the fact that they only could have given me what they had. They provided me with a home. They provided me with food. And my grandmother was somebody who she made sure that I learned principles that govern my life today. The things that people enjoy about me today, they were things that she instilled in me. So to throw the baby away with the bathwater, like to say, because she allowed that to happen to me, I should not even take on the things that she taught me, is to throw away everything that I need now as a foundational principle to bring me into the light so that I could help others.
Yeah.
So for me, it's like, I would not have been able to sit here several years ago. It took inner healing and it took being intentional to get to a place where I want to share my story, not for sharing's sake, but to help people understand that the journey is something that is real. It is worth going through it. It's worth facing those things that imprison you, because even now with the exercise that God gave me to do, before I never knew I was about to fall into a hole, because, it would be 9 years past. I don't know. This the same hole from 9 years ago, right?
Same cycle.
But now, even in terms of navigating relationships, which I didn't know before, but he taught me, I'm now able to prevent myself from going blindly into a situation simply because I know what my past did, and I'm able to glean from my pain now. Yeah. So in the gleaning, I'm able to take the usable things that can add, what they say, they normally say nutritional value.
Yeah.
Yeah, the things that provide me with nutritional value that I can use to better my life, I can now stand on my pain and have it elevate me to where I need to be.
I love your story because I think you are kind of a poster for there is another side, that your life doesn't have to be lived in the narrative of your trauma, or how you said, addicted to the victimhood.
Right.
For what it brings to you when you tell your story, that there is life after
Yes.
trauma, and that you can come into places of healing, that there is a you that can glean from and learn from the pain, but you don't have to make your pain a monument.
No, no.
You don't have to worship at that place of pain. Now, Shantel, you know that with your story, I literally sit here and talk till kingdom come. But we do have to wrap up
Yes.
healing conversations at some point. I think you need to write the book and have the conversation on many different platforms. I think that God has given you a way to see your story in a way that helps people come up and see it from a different perspective.
Yeah.
The fact that you will sit here and honor your grandparents, which again is just the healing and the redemptive heart of God in full manifestation in you, and that you can separate the bad and not villainize them. What happened, of course, we can't reduce it.
No.
The bad was bad.
It was, yes.
And it brought about so much brokenness in your life. But the fact that you can still honor that which was good in their lives, and honor their memory in terms of what they are instilled in you, that is still a part of the foundational realities of who you are. That speaks to the ways that you have grown, because you haven't stayed in the anger of your process to healing. Healing happens in stages,
Yeah.
and one of those stages is anger. And you could have very well stayed in that place of anger. We've seen people that have remained in that place of anger, and it leads to them becoming the
victims.
perpetrator.
And the
then,
perpetrator,
and then they victimize other people
Right.
with their anger, triggered constantly and consistently. And what I see in you is that you have taken that journey from that place of numbing that sometimes is necessary, because we don't have the capacity to deal with everything that has transpired. But you have journeyed to that place of acceptance and forgiveness, and the healing is in motion for your life. So I think you've already addressed it, but I would want you in closing to address it again, in terms of, why do we owe ourselves to take that journey to healing, no matter how difficult your story or how dark the darkness has been for your life? Because I think you can't listen to your story and not say it was a very dark place,
Right.
from a very young beginning, that you were thrust into the darkness that it's, and I'm not saying that there aren't stories that are worse or stories that are darker than yours, but you cannot see that it was anything but a deep level of darkness. But you also can very much well see that you have come into the light.
Yes.
And that you have made progress in your healing. It's in your language, it's in your disposition, it's in how you do life in this moment. Of course, we're all a work in progress.
Yes, we
right?
are.
So tell the people, why do they owe themselves to believe for, and lean into and do the work necessary to live life after trauma?
I think the main thing is this. Whenever we experience trauma, it is stored in our souls. And if we have been given a promise that we will prosper as our soul prospers, we have to start doing the work that's required to clean those places and spaces out, because even in the midst of me experiencing certain levels of healing, there were still certain things that kept me from going out and actually doing way better than I can do now, even in this moment, right? So I believe that it's so important for us to get healing. For those of us who haven't received healing as yet, get healing. You cannot do it alone. You cannot walk through this healing path alone. And especially, you cannot do it without God.
Yeah.
God has to be in he is in the midst of it. Even if you can't see it even now, he was there with me when everything that happened. And at the moment, at each moment, he gave me a promise that it would get better. So in us, I think the importance of getting the soul cleansed and healed out, and being able to really journey, it gives you that freedom that you need, so that when you find yourself in places of success, because there are people like, even, I mean, we had a full story about him, and I just want to bring him up for one brief second just to prove a point. R. Kelly was someone that people talked about. They talked about what he was doing. They focused on his symptom, but nobody ever bothered to think about the thing that happened to him that caused him to now grow up to become the person who is doing what he was doing, right? Mm-hmm. They talked about him and his experience, where as a child he went through pain and he went through abuse and all of that stuff. And just hearing all of the people that were close to him not even feeling the need to find him help. Like they were benefiting from him being the person that he was until they were not benefiting.
Yeah.
And even the people who, like his teachers, people who watched his behavioral patterns change right before their very eyes and knew that there was something wrong, didn't even seek help for him as a child. Everything produced itself up to the point where he was. So we all know that, guess what? It's saying that pain can live with you as long as you're alive, and if you don't do anything with it, it's not going to go away. You thinking that you could forget it, because I used to try to forget what happened to me. It never gave me the freedom that I needed as a person to thrive. It always, at the back of my mind, had something. I would have my own language, my self-talk, where I wasn't worthy. And even if I was surrounded by people who were showing me and telling me, like, listen, Shantel, you're worthy of love. It's okay. It's okay to be safe, even with people who really want to have your best interests at heart. If I didn't get the healing that I needed to get, I would refuse that help, because I'm thinking now that everyone's like that.
Yeah.
Because this is so true for me. So my thing is, get the healing, seek help, connect with the people that you need to connect with, because it doesn't go away. You just manifest more of the same kind of pain. Then what we don't realize and understand is, if we don't get the healing for ourselves, we pass it on to our children, whether it be in abusing them verbally, physically, emotionally, or whether it be from fear, where we parent out of fear and we try to shield them from everything. Don't do this, don't go there, because we remember what happened to us. What we are doing is we're just delaying the pain, because we are not even giving them the language that they need, for it. And teaching them how to effectively navigate these different things, because you can navigate it. I think it's just best to get the healing, so that as you heal, you can actually move forward.
Love it. Thank you so much for sharing such a vulnerable story with us and letting us into even just a small glimpse of what you've been through, but also the work that you've been willing to do. I honestly wish that we were making the announcement of how they could get your book at this moment, but then that's an assignment for the future for you,
Yes.
and I think you definitely need to continue to tell your story and to give people permission to engage it, to heal. Like you said, the pain doesn't go away. People, you can suppress it, you can run from it, you can hide it, you can try to overcome it. Time doesn't heal all wounds. People can be in their deathbed at 100 years old, lamenting over things that they never allowed themselves to heal from, that happened 50, 60 years ago. You deserve a healed you, embracing every part of what God has for you in your life's work and destiny and purpose. And so this is what Healing Conversations is about. We want to engage the hard topics. We're going to want to break the silence of some difficult situations. I pray for a Bahamas that is willing to talk about the incest that has happened in so many of our homes, so that victims will be healed, perpetrators will be delivered, and so that we can create families
Yes.
that are parenting from grace, grace-filled parenting. The Lord has literally hijacked me over parenting my daughter from a place of fear, and not giving her the freedom to, just discover.
Right.
And to embrace what God wants to do in and through her. I hope that you were impacted and truly blessed by the vulnerability in the conversation, by the authenticity of the conversation, and by the hope-filled conclusions that Shantel has come to in spite of what she's experienced in her life. I hope that you were empowered to embrace and to go ahead and engage your healing, whatever path you need to take moving forward, depending on what you have experienced. The Lord has a solution for you. There's no darkness so deep that his light cannot penetrate.
Yes.
And so we invite you into the light of his healing. He is Jehovah Rapha, and that's not just physical healing, that's healing for our wounded souls. All of us have experienced some kind of wounding. Some are darker than others, but the light of God can penetrate all of it. God bless you. Thank you for tuning in, and go ahead and just bless God for his continued work in your life. Even for those of you that have been affected by incest and need to have a conversation, we pray that you find a leader you can trust, a community that you can belong to, and that you begin to engage your healing moving forward. For those of you that are believers, we will place a link under this video for virtual therapy. If you desire to connect to a therapist and begin the healing conversation, we will place a link in the comments so that you can begin that journey. You can come and visit us here at Legacy Church and let us pray for you, minister to you, and help you to begin the journey for your healing. You owe yourself at least to take the first step. And we hope that this was at least a seed that was sown into your life that will give you the courage to take that first step towards your healing. God bless you and have a wonderful, wonderful life.